Detroit Diesel's Series 60 became the king of American trucking, but there's something they don't want you to know. In 1987, there was already an engine that made their revolutionary inline-six look like a toy. It was available right here in America, and it was a 600 horsepower monster. So why did every trucker ignore one of the most powerful engines they could legally buy? When the Detroit Diesel Series 60 arrived in 1988, the entire American trucking world was dealing with a problem nobody wanted to admit. Every major manufacturer was still building engines designed in the 1960s and 70s. They were loud, they leaked, they wasted fuel, and they weren't getting any easier to keep alive as emissions rules tightened. Fleets were demanding something that ran cleaner, lasted longer, and didn't require a mechanic to live inside the engine bay. Operators wanted an engine that could go a million miles without a rebuild, and they wanted it without giving up the power they were used to. Detroit's answer was an inline-six that looked ordinary on the surface, but represented a total break from their past. The Series 60 was the first mass-produced, fully electronically controlled heavy-duty diesel engine sold in the United States. Every part of its operation, from fueling to timing to diagnostics, ran through Detroit's new electronic management system, DDEC. For fleets, this was the first time an engine could tell you exactly what was wrong instead of forcing mechanics to guess. DDEC stored fault codes, recorded driver behavior, and let shops fix issues faster than ever. While most American engines were still relying on mechanical injection and a mix of outdated electronics, Detroit came out with a fully integrated package that felt a generation ahead. But raw technology wasn't what won truckers over. The Series 60 solved the two problems that fleets cared about most: fuel economy and downtime. The early versions produced between 330 and 365 horsepower, later rising to 400 plus as the engine matured. Many operators saw fuel savings of half a mile per gallon or more compared to their old two-stroke Detroits or big mechanical cats. That adds up fast when a truck runs 100,000 miles a year. Even better, the Series 60 rarely needed the constant tinkering that older engines demanded. No blower seals, no governor adjustments, no timing rack issues. It was a quiet, clean-running engine that didn't smoke like a freight train every time you hit the throttle. Fleets didn't just like the Series 60, they trusted it. And that trust mattered more than anything else in American trucking. Detroit already had one of the largest service networks on the continent. Every shop had the parts. Detroit's dealer network made it easy to support. Mechanics quickly adapted to the new layout, and training time was far shorter than what a European-style engine would have required. Components were stocked from coast to coast, which meant trucks got repaired quickly and went back to earning money. An engine can be powerful, but if it takes a week to find parts, fleets don't care. The Series 60 fit perfectly into the structure American trucking had already built, and that alone gave it an enormous advantage. While European manufacturers were building bigger engines with higher horsepower ratings, American fleets weren't looking for the biggest numbers. They wanted engines that could run predictable routes with predictable maintenance. They wanted something their drivers understood and their mechanics could tear down blindfolded. The Series 60 hit that sweet spot. And that mindset is what makes the next part surprising. There was a more powerful inline-six available in the US, but almost every American fleet ignored it. While American fleets were locking onto the Series 60, Volvo was already building an inline-six that pushed heavy truck performance into a completely different category. It was the Volvo TD-162, a 16.2-liter diesel introduced in the mid-80s and immediately set a new bar for what a long-haul engine could do. Most American drivers had never heard of it, but overseas, especially in Scandinavia and Australia, it earned a reputation as one of the toughest and most capable truck engines of its era. The TD-162 didn't need flashy marketing or a long list of electronic features to make its point. Its size alone told the story. This was a massive inline-six built for extreme conditions. Volvo engineered it for hauling timber through the mountains of Norway, pulling heavy freight across frozen highways, and running triple trailer combinations through the Australian outback. Those environments demand engines that don't just produce power, but hold it under load for hours without complaint. The TD-162 was designed for exactly that kind of work. Even in its road-legal truck configurations, the engine pushed 550 horsepower at a time when most American Class 8 engines were still hovering in the 350 to 425 range. The Series 60 eventually reached similar numbers, but not until years later. The TD-162 was already producing over 550 horsepower in the late 80s, years before Detroit pushed the Series 60 past the 500 horsepower mark. And this wasn't marketing fluff. Operators overseas were running these engines hard every day, often at weights that would send an American DOT officer into cardiac arrest. The torque curve was where the TD-162 really separated itself. European heavy haul conditions reward engines that pull from low RPM and stay planted instead of dropping off at the first sign of a grade. Volvo tuned the TD-162 to deliver thick, steady torque without needing to rev the engine out. For logging companies and long-distance haulers, that meant confident climbing, controlled descents, and far less gear hunting. Anyone who drove one remembers how composed it felt under load. It didn't sound strained, it didn't surge, and it didn't need constant throttle correction. The Series 60 was smooth and efficient, but the Volvo felt like it had another class of muscle behind it. The most surprising part is that the TD-162 wasn't some exotic foreign engine that Americans couldn't buy. Volvo quietly offered it in select heavy trucks sold in the United States and Canada during the late 80s and early 90s. These were mostly vocational models and a few regional tractors sold under the Volvo and White GMC names. The engines were here, sitting in dealer lots, legally available and fully capable of going toe-to-toe with anything built by Detroit, Cummins, or Cat. Yet most American operators never knew they existed. Seeing one on US highways today is almost impossible, partly because so few were sold and partly because the people who bought them weren't long-haul fleets. They were construction outfits, logging companies, and niche operators who didn't care where the engine came from as long as it worked. Those trucks quietly did their jobs until they aged out, while the Series 60 exploded in popularity and became the new default. The result is a strange piece of diesel history, an engine that outperformed America's most famous inline-six, but barely left a footprint on the very market where it could have made the biggest impact. For all its power, the TD-162 never stood a chance in the US because it entered a market that didn't reward muscle. American trucking cared about dealer support, parts availability, and predictable maintenance schedules. The Series 60 fit that system perfectly. It was easy to work on, cheap to keep running, and supported by a coast-to-coast network of Detroit diesel shops. Fleets didn't just buy the engine, they bought the infrastructure behind it. Volvo couldn't match that in the 80s or 90s, not even close. Volvo's biggest obstacle wasn't the engine, it was the badge on the hood. At the time, American operators didn't want to touch anything foreign, especially when it came to powertrains. Fleets had decades of experience with Detroit, Cummins, and Cat, and they were comfortable with how those companies operated. Switching to a Volvo engine meant changing parts suppliers, retraining mechanics, and trusting a manufacturer most drivers only associated with cab-overs and European oddities. Even if the TD-162 was stronger, fleets didn't trust what they didn't know, and that hesitation cost Volvo sales. There was also the issue of how American trucks were spec'd. In Europe and Australia, hauling heavy loads up mountains or across the outback demanded huge torque and big displacement. In the US, the average long-haul fleet didn't run those conditions. They pulled lighter loads on flatter highways, often at set speeds on predictable routes. Fuel efficiency mattered more than brute force, and the Series 60 delivered exactly that. The TD-162's extra power didn't offer most American carriers any real advantage. It looked impressive on paper, but it didn't solve a problem they actually had. Cost played its role too. Volvo trucks equipped with the TD-162 were more expensive than equivalent Freightliners or Kenworths running a Series 60. For fleets buying dozens or hundreds of units at a time, even a small price difference added up fast. And because Volvo didn't have the volume or the domestic manufacturing muscle of its American competitors, it couldn't bring prices down to match. When the cheaper option was also the more familiar one, the decision was easy for most operators. Another barrier was service time. If a Series 60 went down, most towns had a shop that could fix it the same day. With the Volvo, a truck might sit for days waiting on a part or a technician who knew the engine. The downtime alone wiped out any benefit the engine's extra horsepower offered. A truck that isn't moving isn't earning, and fleets didn't need a spreadsheet to tell them which option kept their wheels turning. Marketing didn't help either. Detroit Diesel aggressively promoted the Series 60 as the new standard for American trucking, and fleets bought into that message because it matched what they were experiencing on the road. Volvo never pushed the TD-162 with the same energy, especially not in the United States. It was treated as just another power option, not as the flagship engine it actually was. In the end, it didn't fail because it wasn't good enough. It failed because it didn't fit the American trucking environment. Fleets weren't looking for the strongest engine. They were looking for the one that simplified their operations. The Series 60 did that first, and for a time, better than almost anything else on the road. The TD-162 simply arrived in the wrong place at the wrong moment, with too little support to change the habits of an industry that had already made up its mind. The TD-162 never made a mark in American trucking, but in the places where it did catch on, it built a reputation strong enough to outlive the trucks it powered. In Scandinavia, the engine became a staple for timber haulers, running steep grades with fully loaded trailers on icy roads. Operators prized its ability to pull hard at low RPM without surging or dropping off, something that mattered in terrain where losing momentum meant losing the entire climb. Australia pushed the engine even harder. Road train operators strapped 2 or 3 trailers behind Volvo F-16 tractors and ran them across the outback in heat that destroyed lesser engines. The TD-162 handled it because Volvo overbuilt almost every internal component. Its crankshaft was one of the heaviest in any production inline-six of the era, designed to absorb constant load without flexing. The block carried extra material in the main webs and deck, making it resistant to distortion even under extreme thermal stress. These were not design choices meant to save weight or maximize efficiency. They were choices made to keep the engine alive when it spent hours pulling gross weights that would never be legal in the US. The fuel system was another standout. Volvo used a mechanical injection system with precise cam profiles that delivered consistent fueling even when the engine was hot and under strain. Drivers who ran these engines in the Australian interior often commented that the TD-162 didn't fade in high heat the way some American engines did. It held its power, kept its temperatures stable, and didn't punish drivers with unpredictable boost behavior on long climbs. When you're running 120,000 pounds in desert conditions, that consistency isn't a luxury, it's survival. Cold weather operators noticed something different. In northern Sweden and Norway, drivers appreciated how quickly the TD-162 reached operating temperature and how reliably it maintained oil pressure in sub-zero conditions. Volvo's oil passages were intentionally oversized, and the cooling system had enough reserve capacity to handle both deep winter and heavy summer loads. The engine's adaptability to extreme temperatures was a major factor in its popularity across 2 climates that had nothing in common except their hostility to machinery. Another detail the US never fully experienced was the TD-162's durability in constant load work. European trucks often spend far more time at sustained RPM ranges than American ones, and the 162's internals were engineered for those duty cycles. Its long connecting rods reduced cylinder side loading, increasing piston lifespan. Its massive bearings spread forces more evenly, and its reinforced forged aluminum pistons, strengthened with steel inserts, tolerated abuse that would have cracked lighter designs. Operators who rebuilt these engines frequently noted that the bottom ends stayed in excellent shape, even after hundreds of thousands of miles in environments that routinely killed weaker designs. The transmission pairings also played a role in how the engine performed. Many 162-equipped trucks ran Volvo's heavy-range manual gearboxes, which were geared for climbing rather than cruising. These combinations made the most of the engine's torque curve, giving drivers control on descents and tight throttle authority on steep grades. A Series 60 paired with an American overdrive transmission excelled at long-distance cruising, but the 162's setup was built for real terrain. Hills, switchbacks, and brutal loads. The US missed all of this because the engine never reached the volume needed to prove itself here. The few operators who did buy TD-162 powered trucks often ran them until the rest of the vehicle failed. The engines themselves almost always outlasted everything bolted around them. Overseas, that reputation earned it a loyal following. But in America, it barely registered, even though it was one of the strongest production inline-sixes available to US buyers at the time.